Let's lighten the mood
man
and talk about Israel shooting a bunch of Palestinians at the gate.
Oh my gosh!
No, just because Fisher's here, he pays attention to it. He is going to outrage Thaddeus Russell regardless of what he says.
He's half Jewish, so he can weigh in on these things.
I'm actually not half Jewish, but I might as well be. I'm 100%. I'm 100% Israeli by marriage. Which is
that how it works?
No, it's not how it works.
But it might as well. I mean, at this point,
you could still be an anti-Semite. So why don't you do your best?
My Catholic family is thousands of miles away, and there's just as much Hebrew spoken in my home as English at this point. So yeah.
This week we have a couple of different things happening in Israel. We have the movement of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Yes, it's an interim,
and it's not really
embassy.
Yeah, I think they spent like $400,000 essentially to move the ambassador, some security staff there to put a new plaque on the building.
Yes,
but this is a big deal because for the longest time the United States has been reluctant to acknowledge Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Every country has been reluctant to acknowledge Israel, Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
But apparently, with the United States doing this, there are some other folks who've indicated that they may in fact follow suit, and this happens against the backdrop of what has been several weeks, actually, of Palestinian activities on the border, where groups of people are either protesting, demonstrating, or perhaps running at the border. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying or perhaps because all of these things seem to be happening at the same time in some cases.
Yes.
In some cases throwing rocks, in other cases starting fires. There has been reports of a guy with an AK-47 who was like shooting down Israeli drones. There's been all kinds of stuff. I even saw reports of someone flying a flag that had Nazi swastikas on it.
It appears to have been a confirmed story.
This was in NPR. So it's been a bit crazy. It's called the Nakba.
That's
which is what the Palestinians call it, which they celebrate on the 15th, which as Fisher's, I knew it meant the catastrophe.
Yeah.
I know.
I'm talking to the listeners. I know you know.
Okay, good. Because I know a lot of things about this. And this is the
He's
thing.
Trying to flaunt knowledge.
Actually, no, I am. There's no notes. The boys just flowing.
Yeah.
And this is the thing, Fisher. This is the thing, Fisher. I set this up because I'm familiar with a lot of the details of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Mm-hmm. And whereas my libertarian instincts like lead me in various directions when it comes to foreign policy stuff, I constantly find myself wanting to avoid talking about this particular topic like the fucking plague.
Yeah, this is like the way I am with guns. I guess Israel-Palestine is with you.
It's so crazy. I mean, everyone seems to have made their mind up about this stuff completely and totally.
So, I mean, I could... really, honestly, the way to go about this conversation is who do you want me to piss off first?
Thad, always Thad.
Yeah, because I guess if I'm going to piss off Thad, I'm going to say something like this: I believe Israel has a right to exist. Right, I'll start with that. Now, Thad's head's probably exploding right now, and a lot of people would say, "Well, it's a colonial state. It was born through people being
nationalist.
People being moved from their homes. And as though no other wars in the early 20th century were involved the movement of borders or the movement of entire peoples. So literally every fake state in South Asia and in the Middle East where people were moved left to right, north to south, should be not legitimate by that standard. Terrible things were done by the Israelis during the War of Independence. Terrible things were done to the Israelis in the War of Independence. You could make the claim that the Balfour Declaration itself was illegitimate, but how far back are we going to go? Where do we say at some point this thing happened, and also the Holocaust happened, which created a whole rush of refugees to that area to fulfill this plan that they had for about a century. And a war took place, and peace was always a two-state solution was always on the table. So now I've pissed off that side. I've pissed off the libertarians there. As anyone who's followed my work over the last few years knows, I'm willing to piss off, my own family with my crazy takes that include things like, if you're occupying people, you should always be pursuing peace. You should always be pursuing an end to that occupation. You have you have an absolute moral responsibility to end this status quo. Now, I know that they've been good faith actors to the best that they can be as an occupying power offering 97% of the West Bank and Gaza and a contiguous Palestinian state. These are things that were on the table as recently as 10 years ago when Olmert was the prime minister. And at every turn, I guess the best hope was when Arafat was negotiating with, I guess it was Barak at that point, Ehud Barak, when the end of the Clinton administration, there was that last-ditch deal where Clinton basically got the deal together, and Arafat kind of walked off mumbling about, right of return. If every Palestinian who makes a claim that they were kicked out of their home in 1948 and their descendants don't have a right to return to those homes in present-day Israel, then it's no good. And that's never going to happen. I know that is something that the pro-Palestinian negotiating side insists upon, but that's just that is as untenable as the Israelis putting up permanent settlements in the West Bank in what is the only land available left to have a two-state solution. So I'm already ping-ponging all over the place, but as you can see, I kind of try to hold both sides to some certain sense of responsibility and some sense of morality. And on the Israeli side, I would say, yeah, I know you've been burned a million times. Yeah, I know the whole world hates you, but you still are occupying millions of people. And now you're taking away, now you're basically permanently saying what's left of the land that's available to them is going to be pockmarked by your own settlements that will be permanently guarded by Israeli military.
I hear you condemning violence on many sides.
I am condemning violence on many sides. So now I've completely scrambled around. Like, I guess just by that little word salad, peace is the thing I'm rooting for. And I think that Palestinians have a right to exist and have a right to citizenship. And if the Israelis insist on just saying, hey, we haven't had a partner in peace, the status quo is good enough for us, and we're going to build settlements, I would say you are earning the title of occupier. You are earning the title of apartheid state.
I was going to say, is it an apartheid state?
Absolutely. If millions of people don't have the right to vote, don't have the right to leave, don't have the right to travel, what else could it be?
We can't import various essential goods.
Yeah, I mean, and even the whole the Gaza scam. So, of all people, Ariel Sharon, one of the fathers of the state of Israel, a legit war criminal, he was the last best hope for peace there because he broke from the Likud party, which is the party in power right now under Netanyahu, started his own party called Kadima, which means forward in Israel, and grabbed a whole bunch of Labor and Likud types and actually won the election and actually was governing under the and Sharon said to the Knesset, I know you don't want to hear this, but it's occupation. Sharon said that. 2005. And he's the one that unilaterally pulled out of Gaza, which was good, get the settlers out of there. But the idea that a lot of pro-Israeli people will say is that they pulled out of Gaza and look what they got. They got rocket fire. It's like, yeah, they did. They did. And Hamas is a terrible fascist regime. We can get into Hamas in a little bit.
Yes, no objections there.
But the occupation didn't end because if you are still sealing off the borders and the waterways and flying drones and basically have shoot at will orders if anyone gets near that border, and you're like, there's literal, this is horrible. This kills me, this kind of thing, because as somebody who believes the state of Israel has a right to exist, it is government policy to have Gazans survive on as few calories as possible.
Yeah.
All right. And this is something that they're not even ashamed of. Like this is they don't talk about it much, but it's out in the open that they want to make life as difficult as possible for Gazans under the idea that they will somehow overthrow Hamas.
Yeah.
So they're imposing sanctions on their own population.
Sure. I mean,
like in the same
a section of them.
It's the same kind of a mentality. Like, once they find their conditions to be so terrible, then they'll somehow overthrow their leaders, but in a peaceful and good.
Once they're starving, they'll be able to overthrow these heavily armed people getting arms from Iran.
I've been, as I mentioned, reading John McCain's book, and there's a lot of it is thundering against Vladimir Putin, which I, as we all know, agree with on as a general proposition. It bogs down the details, but they talk a lot about the Magnitsky sanctions. And the thing is, like, the Magnitsky sanctions, which target very specific human beings and oligarchs and government officials, and saying you can't do your business or your banking in our country and maybe in our friendly allied countries, targeted. we're not going to try to starve a population into changing their leaders.
Right. You go after the oligarchs.
Go after the oligarchs.
Directly. Try to make it painful for them.
And Putin hates these things and responded to them in many senses much more sharply than he did to broader sanctions against his own country. And of course, and there's like this available lesson to everybody out there, like, stop these kind of like, let's impose sanctions against country sanctions, because the literature has shown almost exclusively that they don't work. They get undermined very quickly. They also starve people. That's not a small thing. Like, don't starve.
Remember Iraq?
That wasn't good. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't try to do that. But also, like, go after the actual corrupt leaders out there. So just a bracket.
You know, if I may now, you know, throw some shade and now get everybody else on the other side pissed off at me. You know, they're literally there haven't been honest brokers on the Palestinian leadership side of things. So, right. You know, so let's take basically the three most well-known entities. You've got Arafat, who was the head of the PLO forever, and then the head of the Palestinian Authority until he died in 2004. He was worth billions at his death, and at least
that's because he's a faithful public servant. At
least $1 billion of that was foreign aid, which he completely took of his own, and his wife, living in exile in, I believe, France, when he died, took a great deal of that with her. His successor, Mahmoud Abbas, he's supposed to be the good one. He was the one like in the late as Arafat was dying. Sharon wouldn't meet with him, but he would meet with Abbas, and Abbas has been the head of the Palestinian Authority now for 14 years. He's an open, overt anti-Semite, and was giving a speech the other day that was straight out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He's the good guy. He's the one that's supposed to be like acceptable to, you know, an acceptable negotiating partner. And he's corrupt as fuck too. And there's a reason Hamas won the one election that they had in Gaza and threw the Fatah party out. Mm-hmm. And then those that were left were brazenly murdered by Hamas. And there's a reason why Hamas runs Gaza and the Palestinian Authority runs a portion of the West Bank, the portion that Israel allows them to run. So now you got Hamas, and Hamas is a death cult. Hamas is a Islamist fascist death cult funded by Iran, and they are they're terrible. If they were in charge of any other state, there'd be no tears shed for them whatsoever. They murder their own people, whether they are gay, whether they are suspected of being informants. Like take the IRA and the shit they did to the people in Northern Ireland to keep them terrorized and under their thumb, and multiply it by numerous factors. It's in their charter that they will never accept not only not accept a state of Israel, but not accept any Jews in the state of Palestine if there was a unified Palestine. They're bad guys.
Yeah, I was reading the New York Times, some of the New York Times reporting on this, and they were describing the situation where there were folks from Hamas who were telling crowds, like, run at the fences, go at the fences. The Israelis are retreating from their positions.
Yes.
While in fact the Israelis were reinforcing their positions.
Yes.
Like, they are genuinely using these people as meat, just throwing them at a meat grinder.
They've launched
it's deplorable.
when these horrible wars where Israel, in my opinion, goes too far. When they fire from schools, they fire from hospitals, and then Israel levels 5 blocks and kills 100 innocent people. In this case of Israel and Palestine, even people like me who believe Israel has a right to exist, every 4 years or so when there's a war like this, whether it's in Lebanon or in Gaza, it kills me to see how many people are killed and how many of them are innocent. And also, it kills me to see Israel, which I believe has a moral center, how many people, young men who are conscripts, are just losing their humanity by targeting the innocent. Well, there was a video, an Israeli soldier posted it himself, laughing that he sniped a guy in the stomach last week.
Well, I think that the phrase should be ought to have a moral center. And I mean, it's one of those things where I do think that the egregious, awful conduct on the other side can very quickly corrupt you. As I said at the very beginning of this, I always try to avoid this conversation because my actual interest here is not the 2-state solution. It's sort of the infinite state solution, because my anarchist politics lead me there anyways. But in this particular situation, it becomes a hell of of a lot easier. Like, I don't care about borders or any of that other stuff. It just seems like there are a lot of egregious compromises being made here, and it just seems like a lot of people are rushing towards conclusions that satisfy, you know, their interests in painting someone as particularly awful.
Yes.
Without really acknowledging like the scale of the human tragedy and the very significant complexity that actually exists in trying to understand this complicated and historic challenge.
I think just to go back to your previous point, though, that the maximalist positions that everybody is taking, Twitter for me gets unbearable whenever there's an Israeli-Palestinian flare-up, because I got people that I like on many sides who just are being assholes, and like you said, not, you know, giving an inch or conceding any flaws of the people that they are defending, whether they want to defend them or not, whether Glenn Greenwald wants to admit it or not. He is running interference for a lot of Hamas bullshit when he takes, you know, all of the claims coming out of that side at face value, that all 62 of those people were innocent protesters all fleeing the border. That's not fucking true. The noise of everybody on every side screaming at the top of their lungs becomes really difficult to parse. And I know a lot of people feel that in a moment like this, they have to pick a side. They have to, they hear like, well, I've always understood that Israel's our only ally. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. Then they just go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
They want to hear that side. And then they also, you know, hear that, wow, these people have been occupied for 50 years. Then there's nothing that can justify that. Everything Israel does must be bloodthirsty, must be totally tied into the military-industrial complex. And for me, like the one argument that I think, especially coming from American critics of what's going on right now, that makes sense is that we are still the benefactor state to Israel. We, as American taxpayers and voters, we actually have a responsibility to chime in on this stuff and to affect our own government's policies on these things, because we shouldn't be, you know, giving a, you know, however many $1 billion military aid package Obama signed into law a week to go in his presidency, or 2 weeks to go in his presidency. Netanyahu himself, at his first stint as Israeli prime minister, came to the U.S. Congress in 1996 and said, guys, it's been a great relationship. It's time to cut the cord. We shouldn't be taking military aid from you. Oh, yeah, I wrote about this for Reason and the Daily Beast.
I should read you more often.
Google it. So before the U.S. Congress, Netanyahu said, it's time for us to go our own way in this sense. We'll always be allies and we'll do deals together, but we don't need your military aid anymore, and you shouldn't have that leverage over us anymore. And yet, here we are, a little more than 2 decades later, and that leverage is as strong as ever. And it is it's basically it's a subsidy for the U.S. military-industrial complex, and it ties us into policies that we have no control over.
Right.